Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about the up and coming fight card that's going to be happening this weekend. And of course, the fight card that I'm going to be talking about is going to be that of the PBC fight card, which I knew was coming up, but I did not know was going to be happening directly after the weekend of the Dmitry Bivol versus Artsubetabev rematch, which of course probably was the best all-around card when you talk about the amount of great fights or great matchups that were on there, at least in terms of the amount of intrigue that they had. I started watching boxing, I believe, within that of the early 2010s, right around the era where Canelo Alvarez, where he was starting to, kind of come up as a fighter, and certain guys like Sergey Kovalev and Terrence Bud Crawford, of course, and other fighters like that. Pretty much within my little tenure of watching boxing, or at least overall compared maybe to some other people, that probably was the best all around fight card that I had ever personally seen, just with the all around matchups on that card. So, of course, the next fight card is pretty much, it's going to have a very tough act to follow. But that being stated, I actually think that this fight card, that it's a very decent fight card. I don't think that the main event is really very particularly interesting, at least when you talk about, comparative to the other fights that were on the Bivol versus Artebeda rematch card, or of course compared to some of the other fights on this card. But there actually is a couple of fights on the main event that I do find to be very particularly interesting. But of course, the fight card that I'm going to be talking about is going to be that of the Gervonta Davis versus Lamont Roach Jr. fight, or fight card, which is going to be a PBC pay-per-view event, of course, this up and coming Saturday on March 1st. And the three fights that I'm going to be talking about and trying to break down within this fight, or within this little video right here, is of course going to be Gervonta Davis versus Lamont Roach Jr. Of course, we also have the fight between Jose Valenzuela and that of a Gary Antoine Russell, who of course lost his last fight to, and I believe, and Alberto Puello, the Dominican fighter, who also will be fighting on this card against that of a Sandor Martin. So this is a very interesting fight card. The main event, in my personal view, it's not that particularly interesting. And I think a certain amount of people overall also do not really find this fight very particularly interesting. I haven't really seen a whole lot of people really talk about this fight, and there's pretty much a reason for that. And before I really go into the other two fights, because those are really the fights that I'm really interested in, not really the main event, and it's not to insult Gervonta Davis. I don't completely blame it on him, because of course we know that apparently he tried to reach out to Vasily Lomachenko, and Lomachenko backed out of negotiations, I believe. Of course, there was talks about Shakur Stevenson, but Shakur Stevenson, apparently there was issues there for whatever particular reason. So I don't blame Gervonta Davis completely. But this is just not really a fight that a lot of people are going to be very particularly interested in. Now, there are certain fights that, overall are kind of sleepers where, in my view, people are kind of underestimating the matchup because they may not know that fighter particularly well. Like when you take a look at, maybe certain fights like, Canelo Alvarez versus Billy Joe Saunders, even though that was a fight that many people overall actually liked on the surface, you had a certain amount of these channels that were stating that Billy Joe Saunders had no chance over Canelo Alvarez and that he's just fighting this European bum. I never personally believed that. But the reason why that was is because Canelo Alvarez and Billy Joe Saunders, and that fight still had a great amount of intrigue. The reason why that fight overall had still a great amount of intrigue is because Billy Joe Saunders, even though many people like Dante and Aki TV and certain other people, they'll try to act like Billy Joe Saunders was this bum that just had no pedigree. Billy Joe Saunders was looked at as not only one of the best British fighters in the world, but on top of that, he formerly was looked at as one of the top middleweights in the world. He was looked at as one of the main guys that maybe Golovkin or Canelo Alvarez could fight at one point in time. And he also was a guy that was a legitimate champion both at the middleweight division and also at the super middleweight division. He had beaten guys like Andy Lee, who was a champion. That's how he got his belt. He also was able to beat guys like David Lemieux and Chris Eubank Jr. Now, none of those guys, in my personal view, are really A-grade level fighters, but they're at least fighters to where if you paid attention to boxing, that you would kind of know who they are. Now, Lamont Roach Jr. is a guy that, overall, he's not the worst boxer in the world. And of course, he's coming off of the biggest win in his career over that of a Hector Garcia, who, of course, is a Dominican fighter that Gervonta Davis also was able to defeat, but of course, in much better fashion. It just is what it is. But the thing is that a big part of the reason why people don't really have a great amount of intrigue in this fight is because in order for there to be intrigue with the fight, there either has to be a little bit of mystery or there has to be a little bit of wonder of how the fight is going to play out. And when you compare it to that of a Canelo Alvarez versus Billy Joe Saunders, for example, even though certain people, of course, may say, well, Billy Joe Saunders is a guy that really didn't have that much power. He was a guy that looked a little bit less at the super middleweight division, right? But Canelo Alvarez was a guy that really was just starting at the super middleweight division. He was really looked at as more of a middleweight fighter. And on top of that, Billy Joe Saunders was an undefeated fighter. And Canelo Alvarez had been known for having a little bit of problems against quick-footed fighters and fast-footed fighters, especially that had used that slick style like that of an Araceli Lara or certain guys like that within the past. So there was still a certain amount of intrigue within that fight. And once again, on top of that, Billy Joe Saunders was an undefeated fighter that looked very good against guys like Andy Lee and David Lemieux and maybe some other fighters. So there was going to be some intrigue there. There's no real intrigue for this fight. And the reason why there's no real intrigue for this main event is because what does Lamont Roach Jr. possibly beat or bring to the table to actually challenge Gervonta Tank Davis in? For those of you that grew up within the era, my era of watching sports in the 2010s, or for those of you that ended up watching sports, for those of you that remember Conor McGregor's rise to fame in the UFC when he tried to become a champ, and of course tried to win the belt at the 155-pound weight class, the lightweight division, after he beat Eddie Alvarez, Conor McGregor after that said something that always kind of stuck with me to this day and that I always agreed with. And Conor McGregor said that in order to beat me, you have to have some sort of attributes over me. You have to have height, you have to have reach, you have to have grit, you have to have power, you have to have this, you have to have that, some sort of skills. If you don't have anything over me, I'm going to rip your head off. And that's pretty much what I see right here. What is it that Lamont Roach Jr. really brings to the table that is really going to threaten Gervonta Tank Davis within this fight? Now, of course, you have certain Gervonta Tank Davis fans or guys like Boxing Eagle, overall that are claiming that, oh, don't sleep on Lamont Roach Jr. He's a champion at 130 and, he's got sneaky power and he's a guy that's a very good boxer, right? But, the question is that what does Lamont Roach Jr. really bring to the table over Gervonta Tank Davis? I mean, the only attributes or the only things that he might even possibly beat Gervonta Tank Davis in, I mean, maybe I'll give him hand speed because, of course, he's at a lighter weight class, but he's coming up in weight at this fight. I assume that he's not going to be gaining that much weight, but we don't know if he's really going to be that much faster, if faster than Gervonta Tank Davis at all, really. I mean, of course, he is about 1 or 2 inches taller than Gervonta Tank Davis, but to me, that's not really that much of a factor, especially because it's just really not that much of an advantage. And then when you talk about the reach, I mean, he has like 1 inch of reach over Gervonta Tank Davis. That's really about the only thing that he beats Gervonta Tank Davis in. And all those factors that I pretty much just mentioned, they're pretty much going to be null and void, except maybe the foot speed and the hand speed. And I'm not really quite sure if he's really going to be particularly quicker than that of Gervonta Tank Davis. When you talk about every other factor, there's not one other factor that Lamont Roach Jr. beats Gervonta Tank Davis in. He definitely doesn't beat him in punching power, but he doesn't really beat him in defensive ability. He doesn't really beat him in head movement, in my personal view. He doesn't beat him in all-around boxing ability. He doesn't beat him in getting out of the range. There's not really anything all around that he beats Gervonta Tank Davis in. Lamont Roach Jr. is a guy that, overall, he's a good little boxer, but this is one of those fights to where, an upset could happen, but it's really only going to happen if Gervonta Tank Davis completely sleeps on Lamont Roach Jr. or if he ends up completely underestimating him, coming in way out of shape, or someone overall that really just did not have the right game plan. And the question is that is Gervonta Tank Davis going to do that? And I just don't personally see that happening. I think that Gervonta Tank Davis, at least at this point in time in his career, takes every fight seriously, especially after some of the tougher fights at 135. When it comes down to it, there's just nothing that Lamont Roach Jr. beats Gervonta Tank Davis in. Now, how do I personally think that this fight is going to go? I think that there's a potentiality that maybe the first few rounds that there might be some competitive moments, kind of in some of Gervonta Tank Davis's fights where he's downloading the data, or in all honesty, probably carrying some of his opponents to make the fight look a little bit more competitive than what it actually should be in order to kind of trick the people that, this is a very good fight and that my opponent was better than what certain people thought it was. Sometimes boxers will do that in order to make the event look a little bit better or because they end up being a little bit bored with their personal opponents. Kind of like Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder, for example, in that of the third fight. But I mean, even though Deontay Wilder, even though I don't think that he beat Tyson Fury in any particular category other than power, at least we always knew that Deontay Wilder was going to at least have a chance possibly because Wilder at least has that one-shot knockout power. But it's not like Lamont Roach Jr. can even compete with Gervonta Tank Davis there. And there's not really many people that can, of course, because Gervonta Tank Davis is a guy that overall has exceptional level power. He might be pound for pound the hardest puncher on the planet, at least when you talk about for boxing. It's between himself in a way and Better Beef, in my personal view. Of course, talking about Arta Better Beef and Naoya in a way, of course. But when you talk about it overall, once again, there's just not anything that Lamont Roach Jr. beats Gervonta Tank Davis in. Pretty much not one category, other than some things that pretty much, in my view, are going to be null and void. And I think that it's going to be somewhat competitive within the first couple of rounds. But honestly, I wouldn't be shocked at all if an early knockout ends up coming here. I think that Lamont Roach Jr., of course, is going to try to box around Gervonta Tank Davis. I think that he's going to try. And of course, he's talking all this stuff about, I'm not coming in here to lose. And, I believe that I can win this fight. But, fighters say this all the time. Like, I remember when the Plant said that against that of a Canelo Alvarez, and that was actually a fight that was very particularly interesting because Caleb Plant was an undefeated fighter, and on top of that, he was bigger, taller, lengthier, quicker overall than that of a Canelo Alvarez, at least in terms of hand speed, and someone overall that was a legitimate threat, to a certain amount of people in that weight class. Lamont Roach Jr. is very good at 130, but first of all, Gervonta Tank Davis has been at 135 for a little bit here, and it's not like Lamont Roach Jr. is like this undefeated champion. He's a guy that lost to Jamel Herring just about 5 fights ago. Now, maybe he's improved ever since then, but Jamel Herring, no offense against him, but it's not like Jamel Herring is this super A-grade level fighter. It just is what it is. I've seen Jamel Herring get his ass completely waxed against that of Shakur Stevenson. It just is what it is. So that's why there's not really any intrigue for this fight. They take a look at this fight and they're like, dude, this guy doesn't really have that great of power. He's a decent little boxer, but is he really a guy that can beat Gervonta Tank Davis in terms of movement or foot movement or, pretty much controlling the range or the distance? Not really. Is he a guy that is going to actually be able to set Gervonta Tank Davis back on his ass and catch him with a good shot? Maybe like what a Frank Martin or a Ryan Garcia had the opportunity to do, if they maybe caught Gervonta Tank Davis with the right shot? Not really. Is he a guy that really is going to put Gervonta Tank Davis in major trouble? Not really. And that's why there's not a great intrigue for this fight. But I do predict Gervonta Tank Davis. I predict that more than likely that he's going to get a knockout anywhere from round 6 to round 8. I think that Gervonta Tank Davis, of course, if he really wanted to, I think that he probably could get this fight stopped within about 4 to 5 rounds, to be quite honest with you. But I think that Gervonta Tank Davis, that he does take him seriously. I think that he does take his boxing ability seriously. And I think that Lamont Roach Jr., I think that he's going to do some good things at first, maybe even win 1 or 2 rounds in the early part of the fight. But I think that once he starts to get hit, and once he feels that level of power over Gervonta Tank Davis, kind of like what Caleb Plant did against Canelo Alvarez and Frank Martin did over Gervonta Tank Davis, they're going to start to regress a little bit as the fight goes on. In order to defeat someone like Gervonta Tank Davis, you have to have a multitude of great attributes. You can't just have good attributes. Gervonta Tank Davis isn't just a great fighter. He's an all-time great level talent. Now, I can't call him an all-time great level fighter because he hasn't really accomplished that much, and his resume, of course, is severely lacking when you compare him to all-time great level fighters. But Gervonta Tank Davis has beaten guys like Frank Martin and Ryan Garcia, 2 guys that I would consider A- or A-grade level fighters, and 2 guys that athletically and somewhat in terms of skills-wise would be a legitimate threat. Now, there are certain things, especially comparative to Ryan Garcia, that Lamont Roach Jr. might be able to beat Ryan Garcia in, but Ryan Garcia always had more of a chance over Tank than what a Lamont Roach Jr. ever would. And the reason why that is because, once again, Lamont Roach Jr., he's just not going to be able to threaten Gervonta Tank Davis with any level of power, or in terms of any height and reach, really, or in terms of any distant control. Ryan Garcia, he's not the most skilled boxer around, but at least he has one-shot knockout power in either hand, and on top of that, he's taller and lengthier than Gervonta Tank Davis, and he is somewhat relatively skilled. It's just he has a lot of flaws. Lamont Roach Jr. is a guy that lost to Jamel Herring just a few fights ago. So, people keep trying, Gervonta Tank Davis fans, they keep trying to claim that this fight is like, oh, well, don't underestimate Lamont Roach Jr. Well, of course, he's not to be underestimated, but what does that really say about the fight? It just is what it is. A lot of people don't really take this fight seriously, and they really shouldn't. Because Lamont Roach Jr. isn't a guy that really is a live dog in this fight. Not if Gervonta Tank Davis takes him seriously. And that's why there's been a lot less intrigue in Gervonta Tank Davis fights as of lately. But I presume more than likely that Lamont Roach, that he's going to try overall once again to kind of control the range. I don't think that he does it exceptionally well. I think that he's a good little boxer, but I think that he stays in the range sometimes a bit too often. I think sometimes that, he ends up throwing that right hand. I believe that he is an orthodox fighter. I can't remember. I looked at so much tape that, I can't remember all the fighters that are southpaw or all the fighters that are orthodox fighters anymore. but I believe that he's an orthodox fighter. He's a guy that sometimes when he throws his power hand, overall, sometimes he'll kind of, keep his head there a little bit too long and not move out of the range quick enough. And I think it's only going to be a matter of time before Gervonta Davis either pressures him or hits him with a shot over the top that is going to counter him, and it's going to really, really affect him, and eventually it's going to get him out of there. I don't think that he has the upper body movement enough to really threaten Gervonta Davis. I don't think that he really has the reach to threaten Gervonta Davis. I think that he has good speed, but is it exceptional speed? No, it's not. Is he a guy, in my view, that, is someone that has an exceptional level chin or can take damage to a great degree? No, not really. And if you're just asking me in my personal view, I would give Alberto Puello, and I would also give that of a Sandor Martin, overall, more of a chance to beat Gervonta Davis than that of his opponent tonight, Lamont Roach Jr. And, Alberto Puello, I believe right now, is not one of the main champions at 140. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but, I would have to take a look at that. But Alberto Puello, of course, he's bigger than, of course, Lamont Roach, but in my view, he's also more skilled. And he's also a guy that has more advantages possible over Gervonta Davis than what a Lamont Roach Jr. has. Also a Jose Valenzuela, also that, of a Sandor Martin, also that of a Gary Antoine Russell. Now, I would favor Gervonta Davis in every single one of those fights, but it just goes to show you that there's a reason why a lot of people are not really talking about this main event like that. At least not to the same degree in some of the other Gervonta Davis fights, because people are getting sick and tired of these pick-me fights. It just is what it is. Even Canelo Alvarez in his last couple of fights, even though it wasn't the David Benavidez fight, Jaime Munguia at least had certain things that he could compete with Canelo Alvarez in. He was taller and lengthier than Canelo Alvarez. He clearly was bigger by a decent amount over Canelo Alvarez. He had great power. He was undefeated. There's nothing that Lamont Roach Jr. has over Gervonta Davis to really make this fight intriguing. And once again, he's not skilled enough, in my personal view, nor a great enough athlete, in my view, to really threaten Gervonta Davis in any particular category. It's not like he's a Shakur Stevenson that is exceptional in most ranges, but just isn't that great of a power puncher. He doesn't really have that great of power. It's not bad power, but is it really enough to threaten someone like Gervonta Davis, who has shown a great jaw in the past, and then on top of that, great boxing ability, and a guy that can end the fight with either shot, at any time, and then on top of that, he's probably more skilled than Lamont Roach Jr.? I mean, I'm sorry, but that's why a certain amount of people, they don't really give a shit about this fight. So it is what it is. Really what this fight is comparable to be quite honest with you, is Canelo Alvarez versus William Skull. To be honest, that's really what this fight is comparable to. But at least with Canelo Alvarez, it's a little bit understandable because that fight is the setup of the Terrence Bud Crawford fight. And of course, he's supposed to become a two-time undisputed champion with that. But people are getting tired of Gervonta Davis with these fights. And once again, I don't completely blame him. Lomachenko and Shakur Stevenson, it looked like those fights did not happen, and it was not completely his fault. But once again, it's not like Tank Davis. It's not like he was rushing to take the Lomachenko fight several years ago when Lomachenko was at his peak. And it's also not like he was ever rushing to get in the ring with the Devin Haney or Shakur Stevenson or a Keyshawn Davis. That's why people are going after Gervonta Davis. It just is what it is. You have to take the fights that somewhat people want to see. And say whatever you want about Canelo Alvarez, for example, but Canelo did take a lot of fights that people were somewhat intrigued in. He took the Austin Trout fight. He took the Lara fight. He took the Billy Joe Saunders fight. He took the Callum Smith fight. He took the Caleb Plant fight. He took the Jaime Munguia fight. He took the Jamel Charlo fight. Terrence Bud Crawford, even though in my view it's not as great of a fight maybe as some other ones, but it's still a fight that maybe certain people could be interested in. No one on planet Earth was asking for this fight right here, Gervonta Davis versus Lamont Roach. Nobody in the world. So once again, it is what it is. But I have Gervonta Davis winning by knockout somewhere within round 6 to round 8. I believe that it's going to look maybe a bit similar to Hector Garcia. Except Gervonta, I believe that he's going to be a little bit more dominant within this fight because I think he realizes that he has to take Lamont Roach Jr.'s boxing ability seriously. And I think that's going to result in a more dominant performance by Gervonta Davis. I do think that Lamont Roach will have, his moments. But do I think that he's going to win a lot of rounds? No. Do I think that he's going to last very long in the fight? No. I think that he's more than likely going to get stopped, like I said, anywhere from round 6 to round 8, in my personal view, at a minimum or at a maximum. It just is what it is. I just don't see how he ends up lasting within this fight, but we'll see what happens. But I have Gervonta Davis winning this fight. I just don't think that there's anything that Lamont Roach Jr. really beats Gervonta Davis in, and that's the reason why I'm going with Gervonta Davis. Now going on to the next fight that I really want to talk about, which is probably the best fight on the card, between that of Jose Valenzuela and a Gary Antoine Russell. That is really the fight, in my personal view, that is 50-50. So the question is who would I be going with within that fight between Jose Valenzuela and that, of I believe a Gary Antoine Russell. And by the way, what I'll also state is this: very particularly interesting that Gary Antoine Russell, that he's getting a title shot overall right after he ended up losing to that of an Alberto Puello. Because Jose Valenzuela, of course, is the title holder right now, and Gary Antoine Russell, right after a loss, he's getting a title shot. But you notice that a lot of these LDBC and new media channels that complained when Lomachenko ended up getting a title shot because he was a Caucasian and he had preferential treatment right after he lost to Cerlito, that he got a title shot over Gary Russell Jr. You notice that a lot of these same channels, that they're not bitching and moaning that Gary Russell Jr. got preferential treatment overall by getting a title shot immediately right after he lost the fight to Alberto Puello. And that instead of Alberto Puello getting this shot against, of, I believe, a Jose Valenzuela, that it was that of a Gary Antoine Russell. And the reason why that is because certain times certain names end up holding more of a charge, or more of a money talks, kind of, stance within that of boxing. Alberto Puello is from the Dominican Republic. He's a very good boxer. He's probably even a bit more skilled than that of a Gary Antoine Russell. But the thing is that his name, just a lot of the times, is not really going to shake households. It's not really going to be the main name that people come to see. The Russell brothers are pretty much known within that of the state of boxing. And on top of that, Gary Russell Jr. or Gary Antoine Russell, his family is established in boxing. And on top of that, he's a black American fighter. He's a black American prospect. So once again, preferential treatment is always going to exist within sports. And Gary Antoine Russell is a guy that is somewhat, getting that preferential treatment. But there's not really anything wrong with that. It just means overall that his name, that it's going to carry over a little bit more. And clearly they want to hitch, their name or their wagon to his star, to possibly overall try to get him to become a champion. But Jose Valenzuela versus that of a Gary Antoine Russell, it's a very interesting fight. And this is the fight that, in my personal view, may debatably be the hardest to predict. But if you're asking me who I think is going to win the fight, I'm going to very tentatively and very slightly go with that of a Jose Valenzuela. Now, Jose Valenzuela is not a completely flawless fighter. He's a guy that, of course, already has 2 losses on his resume. Of course, one to an Edwin de los Santos, I believe that one Dominican fighter that knocked him out within 3 rounds. And of course, he had a little bit of problems against Chris Colbert. Now, I don't actually believe that he lost that fight. I thought that it was a poor decision the last time that I had watched the fight. And of course, in the rematch, Jose Valenzuela stood on business. And of course, he was able to knock him out in the rematch and have an even better performance than what he did in the first fight. But Jose Valenzuela is not someone that is completely flawless. But that being stated, Gary Antoine Russell is not someone that is completely flawless either. Many people, like many of these channels like Dante's Boxing Nation or Aki TV, they may take a look at someone like a Gary Antoine Russell on the surface and may say that he's way more talented than someone like a Jose Valenzuela. But to be honest with you, he's really not. Many people assume, once again, that just because a fighter is either Mexican or European or and a black fighter from America, that they fit into the same mold as many of those fighters that came before them, like a Pernell Sweepy Whitaker, or that of a Floyd Mayweather, or like that of a Juan Manuel Marquez, or a Julio Cesar Chavez, or like that of a Vladimir Klitschko or a Lomachenko or something like that. And they don't always fit into that mold. Gary Antoine Russell, in my view, is a lot like his brother, but in my personal view, he's a little bit of a weaker version. Gary Antoine Russell, in my view, is very talented, especially physically. He has very quick hands, and he's also someone that's very decently powerful. But when you talk about who's the better all-around boxer, I do believe that it is Jose Valenzuela. Now, that being stated, is Jose Valenzuela, once again, is he someone that, in my view, is a spotless fighter? No, he's not. Sometimes he crosses his feet and it can cost him to get hit. Sometimes he can be a little bit defensively irresponsible. Sometimes he can get a little bit too wild and crazy, especially if he believes that his fighter is hurt. He gets a little bit too bloodthirsty for the knockout, which is what we've seen a little bit against Edwin de los Santos. And Gary Russell Jr., Gary Antoine Russell, does have great, excellent power. So is it possible that he can hit, that of a Jose Valenzuela over the top with some very decent power and hurt him? It's very possible. But after what I did see with Jose Valenzuela in his last couple of fights, I do believe that he has had made some improvements, especially with his defense. And what I seen in the Gary Antoine Russell fight with an Alberto Puello, I don't think that Gary Russell Jr., Gary Antoine Russell, I don't think that he's as talented of a boxer as what a Jose Valenzuela is. It isn't that he's not talented. He's a very talented boxer and he's very skilled, but he's not someone that's very skilled in a multitude of ranges. Gary Antoine Russell is pretty much a fighter that if he's going to be successful, it pretty much has to be on the front foot. For those of you that notice Gary Antoine Russell within a certain amount of his fights, he's very good when he's in the brawling situation, or if he has you up against the ropes, or if he can kind of beat you up. But in the mid range, he has a certain amount of problems really getting off his counters. He's kind of a sucker for a right hook. At certain times, he can be hit over the top. And overall, I don't think that he works the body enough, at least overall at certain moments. There are certain times where he has his opponents up against the ropes where I think that he spams a lot of those very flashy, quick punches, but they really don't land through. Now, that being stated, he does work the body to a certain degree, especially with that left hand to the body. But I mean, the thing is that I just don't really know overall if it's really going to be enough to really beat someone like a Jose Valenzuela. Now, the fight is 50-50 because, like I said, Jose Valenzuela, he can be beat. And not only can he be beat, but he can be stopped. And if there is a fighter that is going to be stopped within this fight, I think that it would more than likely be Jose Valenzuela than that of a Gary Antoine Russell. Now, that being stated, we did see in the last fight, overall with that of a Jose Valenzuela over an Isaac Pitbull Cruz, he had a very great performance, but I can't really completely base that performance off of the performance of the fight that's going to be happening here because Isaac Pitbull Cruz is not really, a similar fighter to that of a Gary Antoine Russell. Now, they're both pressure fighters, but they have pressure in completely different ways. Isaac Pitbull Cruz is a guy that has a very tight defensive guard. He's also a guy that's even shorter and not as lengthy as that of a Gary Antoine Russell. I've been telling people for years now that Isaac Pitbull Cruz is a guy that is a supremely one-dimensional fighter. That's what he is. Now, he's very good at what he does, but he's pretty much going to come forward, keep his high guard up, and he's going to try to spam you with hooks. That's pretty much all Isaac Pitbull Cruz really knows how to do. He's going to work behind the jab at certain times, but other times, especially if he gets frustrated, he's just going to be coming for blood, and he's going to be spamming hooks. He's pretty much like a guy in a boxing game that doesn't really know how to set up his punches and really is trying to knock you out with every punch that he throws with a hook. That's pretty much all he knows how to do. It just is what it is. But that being stated, Gary Antoine Russell is going to be taller. He's going to be faster. I think that he's going to have a little bit more in his game than what an Isaac Pitbull Cruz had. But the thing is about Jose Valenzuela, in my personal view, is that he's going to have to be active in this fight and that he cannot really get disrupted or kind of disheartened by the speed of a Gary Antoine Russell early. And he is going to have to get punches in there and be consistent, especially if Gary Russell is able to get certain punches in there. But that also being stated, he's going to have to make sure that he gets out of the range and that he uses his feet relatively well. Now, he uses his feet relatively well, but there are certain times to where he can just get caught by the punch a little bit too much. There are certain times to where, his chin will be left out in the open. Or sometimes he'll be going, for a left hand, and his right hand will be completely down. Or he'll be going for a right hook, but then his left hand will be completely down. That is a big weakness with Jose Valenzuela. He cannot afford that here. Because if Gary Antoine Russell does catch him flush, which is very possible, then he could potentially get knocked out in this fight. He needs to be very careful. But that being stated, I do think that Jose Valenzuela, even though I don't think that he's quite the physical talent of a Gary Antoine Russell, I think that his power is at least comparable with that of a Gary Antoine Russell. I think that he can hurt Gary Antoine Russell or at least push him back. And I think that he definitely doesn't compete in terms of hand speed, but it doesn't really matter because Gary Antoine Russell doesn't really set up his offense anywhere near good enough, in my personal view, to really be that big of a threat, at least in every single range. Now, it's still very possible that he can beat Jose Valenzuela because it's not like Jose Valenzuela is a master level boxer, but he is a very good level boxer. And he's someone that has good hand speed, and on top of that, he has very good punching power. And if he really can set Gary Russell back, that's really going to help him in this fight. Now, the question will be about Jose Valenzuela is he really going to try to set Gary Antoine Russell back, or is he going to try to outbox him completely just like what he did against that of a Isaac Pitbull Cruz? I'm not really quite sure, but if I had to guess, I think that Jose Valenzuela, I think that he's actually going to be trying to go after that of a Gary Antoine Russell Jr. a little bit more. I think he's going to be taking a look at the last fight with Alberto Puello, and I think that more than likely he's going to see that, in order to be successful against Gary Antoine Russell, you can't just run directly into his shots, but you can find a way to push him back and definitely give him a little bit of problems as long as you know how to use your feet. And Gary Antoine Russell has relatively quick feet, but he doesn't know how to use them very properly. They're not necessarily in a bad position per se, and he doesn't necessarily have bad feet, but he doesn't really know how to move in and outside of the range and set up his opponent for punches unless he's on the front foot. He's a guy that does not fight within the mid range exceptionally well, and he also doesn't really fight on the back foot from what I've seen exceptionally well either. So Jose Valenzuela can get him to run in the shots. He's also a tiny bit more lengthier and a little bit taller, I believe, than the Gary Antoine Russell, which I believe will be a factor. But Jose Valenzuela has to have that jab to the body very early on. He has to have that stabbing body jab, moving his head off the center line. Keep your left hand up at all times. Try to set up Gary Antoine Russell with the right hook. He's a sucker for it, and he also will get hit eventually with the left hand. If he gets within your range or gets you up against the ropes, use upper body movement. Try to create the vacated space, just like what Alberto Puello did. Always use lateral movement within this fight. And on top of that, when you really need to, don't let him get his offense off, because he's a very quick, handed fighter that can use that to his advantage, and he can possibly hurt you. So tie him up and turn him around and really show that you can use your strength and that you can compete with him in terms of athleticism. Because if you let Gary Antoine Russell dictate the pace early, especially with his athleticism, he's going to gain confidence. So Jose Valenzuela, in my view, not only does he need to dictate the pace in terms of the boxing ability, but he also needs to dictate the pace in terms of, I can compete with you in terms of athleticism. I can hurt you just like you can hurt me. Alberto Puello was able to do that. There were certain moments where he really let loose on Gary Antoine Russell, where he was not afraid overall to throw a jab to the body and throw a jab right in his face and throw a left hand over the top and set him up with the right hand. And there was times where Gary Antoine Russell, when he threw with Alberto Puello threw right back and then immediately got out of the range. Now, I don't think that Jose Valenzuela gets out of the range quite as good as an Alberto Puello does. But what I will state is that he definitely showed some major improvements, I think, in the Isaac Pitbull Cruz fight. Once again, it's a little bit hard to judge because of Isaac Pitbull Cruz's style, and he's nowhere near as quick, in my personal view, as a Gary Antoine Russell, and they're also more comparable in size when you talk about Gary Antoine Russell and that of a, Jose Valenzuela. But Jose Valenzuela, in my view, needs to use his feet here. He needs to try to box a little bit in the mid-range. I believe that Jose Valenzuela is going to try to box him at first, but then I do believe that Gary Antoine Russell might land some certain shots, and I think that Jose Valenzuela, that he might try to pressure him eventually. But what Jose Valenzuela needs to make sure to do is that he needs to make sure not to just stand in front of Gary Antoine Russell. He needs to use lateral movement throughout this whole entire fight and keep that left hand up at all times throughout this fight. Make sure also to throw, because Gary Antoine Russell, he throws a certain amount of those punches, but Jose Valenzuela is going to have to be the more accurate fighter throughout this fight. If Gary Antoine Russell is more accurate in the first part of the fight, it's going to be a major advantage for him, within this fight, because that's what Jose Valenzuela needs to be. He needs to take charge. He needs to be first. He's a guy that needs to use his jab, his slight edge in reach and height, and he also needs to be a guy overall, once again, that uses a lot of lateral movement. Now, as for Gary Antoine Russell, you need to try, overall to get Jose Valenzuela at certain times to kind of overextend, hit him a little bit early and use your feet. Try to set him up overall with your own offense as well. That little left that he has to the body is very good, but I want to see more double jabs, because there's certain times to where Jose Valenzuela, when he gets hit with a jab, he'll cross his feet and shuffle his feet backwards, and he'll get hit with the jab, and he kind of will be a little bit surprised by it. That's one of his main faults. He's also a guy that if you hit him, he can get a little bit too wild and crazy, trying to get payback or trying to even it up on the scorecards, which is fine to a degree, but sometimes he can get a little bit too reckless. Try to set up Jose Valenzuela with that. But once again, I'm going to go with Jose Valenzuela. I'm going to go with him by either unanimous or majority decision. But we'll see what ends up happening here. I could see a knockout from either gentleman. I could also see either man winning. It's truly a 50-50 level fight. But I'm going to favor Jose Valenzuela probably about 55-45. Because I assume that Jose's power will keep Gary Antoine Russell back. I think that Jose Valenzuela is the more skilled boxer of the two. And I think athletically he also can compete with him. So I'm going to go with Jose Valenzuela, but we'll see what ends up happening here, because it is going to be very interesting. And if the fight is super close, don't be surprised whatsoever if they give the Gary Antoine Russell, because I have a feeling that more than likely they would prefer Gary Antoine Russell to win this fight rather than that of a Jose Valenzuela. But we'll see what ends up happening. But that is pretty much my prediction for that fight. I have Jose Valenzuela winning this fight by decision. We'll see what happens. But now for the final fight between that of an Alberto Puello versus that of a Sandor Martin. Okay, so for this fight, of course, is going to be very particularly interesting and really, kind of for a multitude of reasons. But both Sandor Martin and, of course, Alberto Puello, they've kind of had, their moment in the spotlight. When you talk about that of an Alberto Puello, of course, he is an undefeated Dominican fighter who, of course, a couple of Dominicans as of recent, they have really impressed me. And one thing I'll say about Alberto Puello is that other than Carlos Adams, he's probably the best Dominican fighter out there, at least as of right now, that I can really think of. Carlos Adams really showed me that he's a very particularly talented fighter, much better than what I thought he once originally was in that Hamza Shiraz fight. Now, of course, Shiraz was showed me that he was extremely limited within that fight. But I mean, Carlos Adams also showed me that he has a multi-dimensional game, which I thought was an excellent, excellent performance, or at least a good enough performance to win the fight. But of course, they scored it a draw. But Alberto Puello is a very good boxer. I don't think that he's quite the boxer of a Carlos Adams, but he is a very decent boxer. And of course, that's why he was able to defeat, a very talented boxer in that of a Gary Antoine Russell in his last fight. He's a guy that has very good defense. He has great upper body movement. He's a decent athlete. He has pretty good power now. He only has about 10 or 11 knockouts, I believe, out of like 22 or 23 fights. But it's a little bit misleading. There are certain guys that have that amount of knockouts because they don't really have that great of power, like that of a Shakur Stevenson. And then there's certain guys that don't have that amount of knockouts because they may have power, but that's just not their type of style, like a Dimitri Bivol or a Lara or a Guillermo Rigondeaux at certain times. Alberto Puello, in my view, is kind of one of those fighters. There was a couple of times where he hit Gary Antoine Russell flush, and he was clearly hurting Gary Antoine Russell to a certain degree, or at least setting him back. And Gary Antoine Russell is not a fighter that, in my view, has a bad chin. He has a decent chin, so he can hurt that of a Sandor Martin. Now, that being stated, even though Sandor Martin doesn't have the most amount of power, he's also a guy that, if you're not careful, he can knock you down and he can surprise you. Of course, he was able to beat Mikey Garcia, although I think Mikey Garcia kind of had one foot out the door at that point in time and wasn't really as prepared for that fight as what he needed to be. But, it is what it is. But Sandor Martin was able to beat Mikey Garcia, someone that has extraordinary level power for his size. And of course, a lot of people thought that he could have won against Teofimo Lopez. I thought Lopez had just pulled out of that fight, but if you had Sandor Martin winning that fight, I can't blame you. I only had Teofimo Lopez, I believe, winning by 1 point in that fight, and I think I scored it like 114 to 113. So I can't really blame you. But the thing is that when you talk about that of a Sandor Martin, he's very quick. But what I will state is this: I am gonna have to favor Alberto Puello against that of a Sandor Martin. Now, why am I personally favoring Alberto Puello over that of a Sandor Martin? For a couple of reasons. First of all, when you talk about both of these fighters, these guys have a very, very similar style. They prefer to be a little bit more within the mid range or on the back foot. They have a great jab, a great stabbing jab to the body. They have an excellent right hook, and overall, they really love to use that rangy, kind of outbox you type of style. But the reason why I'm going with Alberto Puello is that, first of all, I think that he is the greater athlete of the two, at least when you talk about in terms of power and size. I think that he's the bigger fighter of the two. He's also undefeated, so he may be coming into this fight with a little bit more confidence. Although I will state this: I've never seen a fight with Sandor Martin where he really didn't try to win the fight or really did not try to outbox his fellow opponent. But there are certain fights where I thought maybe he could have done a little bit more, at least to take a little bit of charge, although he still clearly was trying to win the fight. But we'll see what ends up happening here. But also on top of that, I believe that Sandor Martin has not fought ever since that of late 2023. So it's been over a year that he actually has fought. He's been out for about 15 or 16 months. I think that there's a very potential, factor that may cause it. Also, sometimes Sandor Martin, he's not the highest amount of volume for a puncher. He's a guy that throws anywhere from 200 something, maybe 300 punches at max in a fight. Alberto Puello in his fight against Gary Antoine Russell threw about 400 something. And in his fight, I believe, against that one undefeated Kazakhstan fighter, who also was a decent fighter, he ended up throwing 300 something. Now, this is kind of a different fight, and it can end up going either way because both of these guys have a similar style. And when you fight a guy that is a little bit of a mirror image of yourself, even when it seems like you should be the favorite guy, it can end up being a much more challenging fight than what was once expected. We've seen this with Teofimo Lopez versus George Kambosos Jr. Even though I don't think that George Kambosos has as much of a package as out of a Teofimo Lopez in terms of an all-around fighter, at least when you talk about combined athleticism and skills, he had such a similar style to Teofimo Lopez that it gave Teofimo Lopez a great amount of hell within that fight. And of course, it ended up giving George Kambosos the much deserved win. But it is what it is. Sandor Martin and Alberto Puello, they have a very similar style here. And if one ends up, letting the other score a little bit too early, and if the other one focuses a little bit too much on trying to outbox the other guy without not doing as much and keep trying to run them into shots without taking charge, the other one could easily find this fight, once again being a little bit, sidetracked, or them slowly starting to lose rounds. So both fighters, in my personal view, they're going to have to take charge in this fight, and whoever is more willing to take charge in this personal fight, or more willing to get shots in there, and is more willing to really let their hands go, in my view, is really going to be the winner of this fight. Who do I believe that fighter is going to be? I believe more than likely that is going to be Alberto Puello. But that being stated, you never personally know, because Alberto Puello is not a guy that, is this constant come forward fighter. I've seen him kind of come forward in certain fights, but he's a guy that boxes a lot like a Sandor Martin. Sandor Martin, what I will state is this: I do think that he has faster feet and faster hands than that of an Alberto Puello, but it is possible that it might be affected with that of the 15-month layoff. And on top of that, I think that it's more possible that Alberto Puello may come forward than that of a Sandor Martin, but you never know. Sandor Martin is always a dog in there. He's always a live dog. He's always a live fighter in there. So it's going to be very particularly interesting to see. What I will state is this: if Alberto Puello ends up losing this fight, it's going to be because Sandor Martin gets to him early, pressures him a little bit, or at least lands some very good jabs and good right hooks that freaks him out early. And then Alberto Puello, he is a little bit slower to the punch than Sandor Martin. He is a guy also that sometimes can advertise his offense a little bit more than Sandor Martin. And it's going to be because Sandor Martin, just like with Mikey Garcia, ends up snake charming him and pretty much fearing him with the great upper body movement that he has up against the ropes, and also the very quick feet and the very quick counters. That's the way overall that he may lose this fight. He'll find the fight losing slowly after a while just by getting slightly outboxed. It's not going to be a complete domination, in my view, of whoever ends up losing this fight. But if he ends up losing this fight, it's going to be because he did not do enough overall in terms of really letting the hands go and fighting a little bit too much in the ranged and lengthy style, instead of really just trying to let your hands go and go after Sandor Martin. Alberto Puello may have to find himself doing that because Sandor Martin is a very tricky customer. He's a guy that's very quick-footed. He's very fast-handed. He's a guy that is a snake charmer in there. He's a very, very good fighter for what he does. He's one of those fighters that is never going to be looked at as an A-plus level fighter, but in terms of a B-grade level fighter, like he's almost an A-minus level fighter because he's so dangerous at what he does. Like there are certain B-grade level fighters that are like that. Like you don't even want to fight them because they may only do one or two things particularly well. I mean, Sandor Martin, what I'll state is this: I actually think that he's a decent all-around fighter. But for what he does that's extremely well with that rangy style, he's so particularly dangerous that he might be able to get a win or two over some A-grade level fighters, like that win over Mikey Garcia and debatably over Teofimo Lopez. So once again, he's a very tricky fighter. So Alberto Puello needs to be first to the punch, but I'm also favoring him a little bit here because I think that he is the greater athlete of the two just by a little bit. And when you talk about also, who might have more gas in the tank, although Sandor Martin has always showed a great gas tank, he has been out for a very long time. And on top of that, Alberto Puello, I think that there's more of an opportunity that, he might come forward. And both of these guys have great upper body movement and get out of the range exceptionally well. But if Alberto Puello starts getting hit very early on, he needs to make sure not to stay within that range. He needs to go after Sandor Martin, stab that jab to the body, moving in and outside of the range, but really dictate the tempo by going forward. That's what he needs to make sure to do. He can try to run Sandor Martin into certain shots, but that's not really the way, in my view, that you beat Sandor Martin. Now, the question is Alberto Puello going to do that overall throughout the whole entire fight? And even if it does, Sandor Martin might be able to beat him in speed, but I assume that Alberto Puello with a slight length advantage. He's taller and lengthier, I believe, by a few inches in both categories. So I think that I'm going to have to go with Alberto Puello, also with him being the fresher fighter, coming off of the biggest win in his career. I'm going to have to go with Alberto Puello. But if Sandor Martin ended up winning this fight, I wouldn't be surprised at all. But I have Alberto Puello winning by that of a majority decision or that of a unanimous decision. We'll see what ends up happening here. But if Sandor Martin won this fight, wouldn't be surprised at all either. But the last two fights, the two fights before the main event, is going to be very particularly interesting. The main event, I don't think that's really that great, but it's still going to be interesting to see how long it lasts. Of course, Lamont Roach is coming to win, but the question is that what's going to happen when, overall you really come and, he ends up getting hit? Are you really going to be able to react to that? Are you going to be one of these guys that still tries to win the fight? Or are you going to be one of these guys that shell up once you feel that power? And there are certain great boxers that even when they do feel that power, they start to shell up because there's not really much more of an option, or you're going to potentially get knocked out. But even if he does potentially try to go for it all, I think that he still is going to get knocked out within this fight because there's just not really, even in skills wise, anything that it really beats Gervonta Davis in. As for the Jose Valenzuela versus Gary Antoine Russell fight, I'm going with that of a Jose Valenzuela very tentatively, but he is going to have to be first within this fight. He's going to have to be very careful, move his head off the center line very well, use his feet to a great degree, and really keep Gary Antoine Russell busy. Try to set him up within the mid range, but also push him forward at certain times. Use great lateral movement. And as for Alberto Puello, it's great to stay in that mid range, but if it's not working, don't be afraid to pressure Sandor Martin and really try to punish him. Make him uncomfortable. You're bigger, you're stockier, you're more powerful than him more than likely, and you're a guy that is fresher. So that's what those guys are going to have to do. But those are going to be my 3 predictions. I have Gervonta Davis by KO or by TKO. I have that of, I believe, Alberto Puello by unanimous or majority decision or split decision. And I have Jose Valenzuela by majority decision overall, more than likely in that fight. But we'll see what happens. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later. Hopefully this time I can go 3-0, but we'll see what happens. But that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think of the fights, and I'll talk to you all later.